Hello, in this presentation we will talk about the Others section within QuickBooks. In other words, those components that are not grouped in the normal cycle, the normal processes of the customer cycle or the sales cycle or the accounts receivable cycle or the vendor cycle or the payable cycle. Those components that will be grouped, that are important, that are used often, but aren't grouped in those normal cycle processes within QuickBooks Online. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info. Here we are within the QuickBooks Online dashboard. We will be continuing with the Get Great Guitars problem. We're going to be looking at those components which don't quite fit into the normal cycles. In other words, if we select this item up top, this plus item, we have a customer cycle, a vendor cycle, and an employee cycle. And then we have this other stuff that's grouped into other. And typically, everything that's included here are going to be normal types of transactions, things that happen normally within the accounting process, things that QuickBooks typically has forms to help us generate and drive the process to make the data entry easy. These are all going to be things that we can think about and should think about, will be easier to think about within terms of their cycle, their processes, in an order of them happening. These items over here are going to be things that happen often, but for whatever reason don't be grouped or are not grouped by QuickBooks into one of these cycles. So let's look at a few of those components and see why that is and how those items will be used within our accounting process. To do that, we're first going to look at the QuickBooks Desktop homepage and get an idea of some of these components in terms of how they were grouped in terms of a flow chart within the homepage, and then we'll go back over here to QuickBooks Online and find those same components and how they will be used within the online version. They'll be used in the same way between the two components, but the flow chart could help us to get a concept of how these things are put together. For a couple different reasons, I like to look at the flow chart on the desktop version. One is that it gives you that pictorial presentation of how things will flow through, which once we have that understanding in our minds, we probably don't need much anymore. But as we're understanding how to put them together, it is a useful thing to use. And two, if you're used to the desktop version and you're moving to an online version, then you may be used to this type of format, this flow chart in the home page. And that could give you some more comfort and, with the process and the change as we see the new process over here. So this is the desktop version, and we're just looking at the home page of the desktop version, which gives us a little flow chart. And this is one area that we can think of the day-to-day processes as we go through these. And we've taken a look at the vendor process, the customer process, and we have or will take a look at the employee process. And looking at the normal data transactions, which QuickBooks typically has driven by forms, so that the data input is as easy as possible. The more tricky thing for us, of course, is to set up those forms, to set up the invoice, to set up the received payments so that the data input can be as easy as possible, and then to interpret what these forms are doing in the format of the financial statements, because that's what we're going to use in order to make decisions. What we're looking at here is really this side of if we were going to match up the QuickBooks Online to the desktop version. These are items that QuickBooks thought were important, obviously, because they put them on the home page, but they didn't include them in any particular cycle. So we're going to go, it's not the exact same grouping here as will be on the QuickBooks Online version in terms of the Others section. And I think it's telling for us and it's helpful to us as we enter this data to see what are the same in terms of the Other section and say the banking section, and what are different as we go through this, what might have been grouped differently and why that would be the case. The most obvious thing within this banking section, this other section that happens, note there's no flow chart in this entire section. So these are just kind of things that QuickBooks said, hey, I don't know where to put them in the flow chart, but they're important, and we think they should be on the home page because there's documentation for all these that you might want to go directly to these. The one of these, however, even though it's in the banking system, which still has this arrow that is indicating, hey, it's kind of part of this system, the customer system, is this item here, which is the deposit. And as we talked about in the customer section, even though the deposit will be in the Others section, you really kind of want to think about it as typically part of the customer section. Even though it's in the Others or banking section, it's really kind of the customer's process because we're hoping that most of the deposits will be from customers in the format of we invoiced someone and then we got a payment in the mail, which we're now making a deposit with, or we made a sale within the store, and we'll later be depositing that sale into the bank at the end of the day. Now, of course, now the question then is, why is it over here in the banking system or the other system, as it will be in the online version, rather than being in the customer's area? And that's because we could have some other types of deposits. We might have deposited money. We might have got a loan. So there could be other ways we got deposits, but we're hoping that most of the deposits will be from customers, and therefore it's kind of an extension, as indicated by the arrow, of the customer section. And then we've got some other items, some reconciling items. Well, obviously the bank account's going to be a huge one we want to reconcile. We've got the write checks here. Now, writing checks, you might think, and it would be part of, and I think the online version will group this a bit differently, would be up here in the vendors section. So the version down here is saying that we're going to write checks, because we could write checks again to basically anyone. The write checks could be used to decrease the bank account. So it's part of the banking system here, obviously, because we're writing checks. You can think of it as something other, or not quite fitting into the flow of, say, the vendors section, because we could write a check, say, to ourselves as a draw or something like that, and use the check writing system in that format, which means we wouldn't typically be in the normal vendor section where we write a bill and we pay for things like expenses and whatnot. So there's going to be the check item that's in the banking here. It may be a bit different when we go to the online version. And then the check register, that's going to be something that a lot of people are used to seeing their checking account in terms of a check register. So I think they just kind of put that in there and said, hey, here's the check register if that's what you're used to. If you want to see things in that format, here it is. The printing checks option, again, not part of the normal flow, but you would think could be part of the vendors section up here, put into the banking section down here. Clearly we can see why it would be in banking. In online, we're going to group it possibly, we're looking at the other section in comparison to the banking section. And then they gave us some other information like the chart of accounts, major account areas. That's going to be something that we use a lot. Items are things that are going to drive our inventory when we create the inventory. So they were saying this is important enough for us to put on the home page. Inventory activities, if we're dealing with the inventory, ordering checks, and obviously they're kind of trying to sell more checks here in case because you have to order checks from the bank and then buy, even if you're printing the checks out of the system. So you might want an easy area to order and buy more checks. And then we have the calendar option here. So let's compare and contrast this to the others section within QuickBooks Online. Here we are in QuickBooks Online now, and we're going to select this type item up here, this little plus item, and see what we have. So remember, we've got the same setup that we did in the home page. We had the customers, we got the vendors, we got the employees, and we got the list of the normal transactions we will have for those items. Then we got the other over here. And once again, we've got these items, and the reason they're in this quick access area is because they're items we're going to use all the time. They're items that we expect to be using fairly much almost on a day-to-day basis. But they're items that, for whatever reason, QuickBooks is not grouping into the normal cycles, the normal processes, the customers or receivable cycle, the vendors or payable cycle, the employee cycle or payroll cycle. We have them over here in other. As we've discussed, the bank deposit is going to be something that we hope to use a lot. We hope we have a lot of deposits and we're going to the bank a lot, and just they know us well over there. We're always depositing money into the bank. And we would think that would be part of the customer cycle here, and it is in many ways. Just note that here it's going to be grouped in the other items. So this is going to be something that we'll use a lot. Transfers is something that we could transfer between different accounts that we can use, possibly bank accounts that we can use fairly often in the transfer area. Journal entries. This is going to be something that is going to be used in terms of data input that another form is not there for. So as we said, most of the stuff here is going to be the stuff that happens on a day-to-day process, meaning we invoice people, we receive payments, we make sales receipts and have a sales receipt, we write checks, we enter bills, we pay payroll. All those things are going to be things that happen so often that QuickBooks makes a data input form for us, will basically do the journal entry for us with that simple data input form, and nobody needs to know much more than that unless they're setting up the system in order to put the data input into the system. but transactions that aren't on a day-to-day basis. If we do something that doesn't happen all the time, not things that are totally unusual to a business, but things that don't happen on a day-to-day process. Things like getting a loan, things like purchasing a vehicle or purchasing equipment and then financing that equipment. Things like the adjusting process at the end of the month. These are things that aren't part of the day-to-day data input from a day-to-day processing, and therefore the default is not a form such as an invoice or a sales receipt, but a journal entry that we'll have to record, and that's when you really can't get around knowing debits and credits. All this stuff has debits and credits in it to set it up to have the thing working, but with these types of things, with the things that aren't on a day-to-day process, those are where we really kind of have to know debits and credits, and we'll touch more on that as we go. Then we've got the statements down here, and the inventory adjustments can be some of those items. Now, some of the things that aren't in this other section that which were put on the QuickBooks page were things like the chart of accounts. That's going to be one. That's over here in the accounting area. So if you went to the accounting area and you go up to chart of accounts, it'll look very similar, but you have a little bit more option in terms of how to sort this. It typically is sorted by, not by the, just the alphabetical order of the name of the account, but typically first by account type. Account types, you can think of the accounting equation first, assets, then liabilities, then equity, then income and expenses, and then more specifically within those account types, meaning the bank account is a specific asset account type, which will be ordered first, then accounts receivable, specific asset, then other current assets, and then fixed assets, and then liabilities, more specifically, accounts payable, a particular liability, credit card type accounts, then all other current liabilities, and then any long-term liabilities. Then the equity section, anything that's grouped in the equity accounts, then anything that's in income, and then expenses, more specifically, cost of goods sold, if we have it, if we sell inventory, and then all other expenses. Within the expense areas, it will then be grouped by alphabetical order within those expense areas unless we have account numbers. If you want to group things differently, then account numbers are useful. If you don't know how this grouping works, though, it's really easy not to use account numbers correctly, which can look really funny. So if you know how to use account numbers, then they're great. It'll help you to order things. If not, you might want to stay away from them until you get someone to set up the initial process well. So that's one thing that's going to be over here. We then have the inventory items are something that was on the home page in the company section that they felt was useful enough to be on the home page. So let's see where those inventory items are. They're under sales. And then if you go to products and services, here's where the inventory is. So if you sell things like guitars or whatnot, like that's what we sell, inventory, then you'll have those inventory items here. If we have service items, we have guitar lessons, then the guitar lessons will also be here. These are going to be used to create the invoices and the sales receipts. We also had checks that were recorded in the banking system on the home page. And that is up here. If we select this drop down, we see that checks is over here in the vendor section. So note that they made a little bit of adjustment there. They said this isn't the banking section, it's the other section. And then they're going to say, well, the checks, we're going to put that in the vendor section. That's pretty much, we're just going to say, hey, that's a vendor. Yeah, you could write a check to yourself. You could write a check, to someone that isn't particularly a vendor. You might be paying off a loan or something like that. But typically we're saying, hey, it's enough in the vendor section that our quick data input, we're just going to put the checks within the vendor section. The check register, another item that was on the home page that we can find here, the check register, is if we go to the accounting down here again, accounting, and then we go to the chart of accounts, the check register is right here. Now, typically we think of the check register as something that's just for the checking account, but we can see this register format for any balance sheet account. So any balance sheet account here, we have this register, which will be kind of like your checkbook register that we'll have. So if you click this view register, then you'll have your register activity. And it's kind of like a general ledger. It looks kind of like a checkbook register. You got your date. You've got the person you're paying here. And then you have your amount. And then you have your other account, which is the in this case, accounts payable or if you're paying like a payroll liability here, accounts payable. The split item will allow you to have multiple accounts. Bank service charges here. So that's typically going to be like the expense account that you're going to have. Here's a normal one finally. Verizon telephone expense. We got an expense. It's decreasing the balance here, and the other side is going to go to the phone bill. So this typically looks kind of like a checkbook, and it's really just your general ledger, your data, your backup for the particular account you're looking at, which of course in this case is the checking account or the cash account. So those are the major components of the things that are kind of in the other section, things we use all the time that aren't always grouped in the same kind of cycles or categories.